Your news channel, Leo Explains, on Instagram, I suppose the first thing I kind of wanted to kind of explore is why do you think people choose that channel, and how did you discover that there was a market for that?
Good question. I, on the one hand, have no idea why someone would trust me, and sometimes people tell me that I am their main source of information, versus trusting, you know, the BBC or the Guardian, Reuters. But on the other hand, I think it's the reality we're living in today. I think for a while, there was a subsection of people who are more passive news consumers, who kind of would consume the news because it was there. So they would watch the TV, they would watch evening news, they would listen to the radio on the way home or while going to work. So they would consume mainstream media, not because it was their conscious choice to do so, but because it was there. It was the only option. You know, you can't just start a TV channel if you want to. You can't just have a radio show if you really wanted to. But now with social media, it changed a little bit because it removed that barrier of entry. So now those passive news consumers, they're just scrolling through Instagram and, you know, they see news posted by someone who looks and sounds like them. And, you know, when it comes to social media, anyone in this room has an equal chance of going viral and being seen by millions of people as the BBC or the Guardian, Reuters, Associated Press. Everyone has an equal chance. And that's just, I guess, the reality we're living in. And I exist in that reality, and I'm just trying to bring a more kind of informed, evidence-based, factual voice.
And that's what's interesting, I think, about your content. One of the things that really catches the eye is that it is, when you read it, and I don't mean this as a kind of trying to throw shade upon it, but when you read it, you think, oh, this isn't necessarily the kind of thing that you think would go viral, because it's not provocative, it's very measured, it's very text-based, and it's very information-heavy.
And when I do different types of content, I do with text, I do videos. If I do videos, they're usually longer, and it takes a while to get to the point. I did try, you know, I tried loads of different types of content. I tried to be provocative, start be like very angry. I never felt comfortable doing that, and whenever I look back at those videos, I cringe a lot because I'm quite like I'm fun, but I'm quite a serious person. And you know, whenever I try to do this like very feelings, emotional content, it didn't really work. It wasn't authentic to me. So I pivoted and I tried to find a different angle. And after like 2.5 years of trying, I managed to kind of find that niche. And, you know, ultimately it's finding the audience, which is difficult. But once you find that audience that also wants, you know, the content that you produce, which is more factual, measured, evidence-based, then that kind of what led to the growth of my page and my social media presence.
Yeah, so in a strange way, you're kind of you're like a counterculture to the sensationalist algorithm, but you've managed to really develop an audience over that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And is that how you describe it? Kind of fact-based. That's kind of foregrounded in your content, and you research it thoroughly, and you do use mainstream research organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I love mainstream media. That's what I consume. I don't get my news from creators like me, but again, I have to deal with the reality that a lot of people do take their news from social media, and I'm trying to be kind of a reasonable voice in that space. It's difficult because the algorithms ultimately prioritize engagement. They don't care about how factual or evidence-based you are. You're not going to be deprioritized in the algorithm if you are not factual, if you're not truthful. So it's difficult because you have to find that middle ground between engagement and being factual. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to build my brand on. And you always, when you're an individual and as a person, I have my personal opinions and views on things. I always have to check myself and make sure that my content doesn't necessarily reflect that. I think I always kind of tell my followers that I want to give you the information so you can decide how to feel and think about the events instead of me telling you how to think about something and how to feel about whatever is happening in politics.
And let's talk about the flip side of that, because you mentioned it, the dangers of independent journalism, as it's called, or by people getting their news through social media and through algorithms. The difficulty is that prioritizes what people call high arousal content, so it prioritizes stuff that's sensationalist. There's no fact-checking mechanism. And we're kind of at the foothills of that being incredibly dangerous. So actually last week I was at a thing called Cambridge Disinformation Summit, which was a meeting of academics and politicians and me, bizarrely, to to think about how to tackle disinformation. And some of the research that came out of that, firstly, the algorithm is very opaque. You don't really know what it is that you're appealing to. You just have to kind of throw it meat and see what sticks. And the other thing is that actually, even sometimes when people are shown fake videos, so there's this research that people were shown deep fakes, and even when they were told afterwards that it was a fake video, the content still resonated with them. So it still sticks with them, and they still took home the message, even though it had this disclaimer. So you're in this very choppy waters. I was wondering if you could respond to like how you think you're an independent journalist doing it really well, but there's people who are with slightly more malevolent intention or who don't have your conscience so much.
Yeah, I mean, the dangers of independent journalism or, content creation, in my opinion, outweigh for now the opportunities because of those algorithms. It all comes down to incentives. I'll give you an example. Let's say if you're at university or you're at school, you gonna get a higher grade for your essay if it's factual and if you make it evidence-based. If you have a strong analysis, you're going to get a better grade because you're incentivized by being as truthful, factual, and evidence-based as possible. When you post on social media, your vehicle is the algorithm. And the algorithm doesn't care about how factual or truthful you are. The algorithm ultimately cares about engagement rate. The higher your engagement, the more people are going to see your content. And that's ultimately is the danger, because it's, there are creators who prioritize facts, like I'm trying to do. And they try to find that middle ground with being entertaining, with, still getting that virality and reach. But it's a very difficult thing to do because the truth, unfortunately, is very often boring. It's not as exciting and interesting. When you try to cover all different perspectives, it's not super exciting. There are always two sides of the story. So the easier way for a creator is to either provide a very one-sided, over-exaggerated view of a story that makes it interesting and ultimately can go viral, or completely manufacture something. And you're not always going to have a breaking story every day. So it's much easier to make up a story, to do something fake, and that would get picked up. And I think there is something psychological that we just tend to trust more an individual than an ambiguous media organization. When it comes to big organizations, we think that they care about business, they care about money. But when you see an individual who looks and sounds like you kind of feel like, okay, that person is just like me. You relate to them, and for some reason, we trust those individuals a little bit more. And with that incentive structure, when you're incentivized by creating highly engaging content, that leads to misinformation. Misinformation leads to you having a very different perception of reality, because one video, whatever, but if you see 100 videos that tell you only one side of the story, or that tell you something that maybe didn't even happen, you create a different reality, and that different reality could ultimately radicalize you. And that's, in my opinion, a very big danger, because the way you see the world no longer correlates with the actual reality. I think a good example of that, it happened a few weeks ago. I noticed this viral story on Instagram, TikTok, and X that Benjamin Netanyahu was killed. He died in an Iranian strike. And I looked at a lot of where it came from, and it was the videos were allegedly fake or whatever, or he wasn't seen in public, but ultimately it wasn't rooted in any evidence. And thinking that a world leader can die and you can hide it is just completely ridiculous. So I posted about it on my page, and I said, just to let everyone know, this is not true. He's alive. There is no evidence of that. And, about 100 people unfollowed me after that, because they believed in that so strongly that they thought I was spreading misinformation, which is ridiculous. But it shows you that you reach the point that you create a different version of reality where Benjamin Netanyahu is dead. And it's ridiculous, but I actually want people like that to follow me, because I'm hoping, I don't necessarily want to only speak to people who think like me. I would love for people who maybe believe slightly more in conspiracies and stuff like that, to follow me, to hopefully over time they can kind of adjust their version of reality so it correlates more with what's actually happening.
Yeah, and I mean, we are really in the, I would say, almost peak moment of conspiracy theory, where I was even having a conversation with a friend last night. I'm sure lots of people have this. Because what was for a long time a conspiracy theory has in some ways been vindicated. For example, Epstein, like that for a long time that felt like a conspiracy theory. For a long time, a lot of the content that's turned out to be nearly true. I mean, 4chan were sort of right. There has been a kind of really dark things happening from those in power, and a lot of the rumors around that, which were a long time seemed absurd, have come to the foreground. And so we're in this space that's very, very tricky and very hard to navigate, and that's interacting with AI, and that's interacting with the capacity to generate deep fakes. What then is your mantra? It's foregrounding evidence and thorough research, and how do you maintain that like authentic relationship with your audience when they're quite divided on that, or when they might have different views?
I think it's the using the right language. If I never say that something is a conspiracy theory, because if I say that, that's kind of quite insulting to people who believe those things. They don't believe those are conspiracy theories. So I'm not going to change someone's mind by saying that something is a conspiracy theory if you believe that that's the actual reality. So it's important to use the language, and ultimately nothing is a conspiracy theory. Things either have evidence to support certain claim or they don't. And I'm trying to provide the evidence for people to make up their mind whether something is true or not. And using the right language to make sure that people, because ultimately it's actually, if you label something a conspiracy theory, you actually do the same thing, because you maybe disregard the evidence, you don't look at the evidence, you just say something is a conspiracy theory, which is basically you doing the same thing just from the opposite side of the spectrum. So I just try to, everything is a claim. It can have evidence, maybe it doesn't have any evidence, and then based on that we can make a conclusion.
Such a good point. And I think the question that you asked, like how do we make the truth as compelling as the lie? And the lie presents itself as certain, but often the truth is nuanced. So it's standing up for nuance and caveats, and perhaps saying, look, I don't know the answer to that, but here's the evidence, you make up your own mind, and some things may be more true than others. So it's taking away some of that absolutism, and I think that's what's really interesting about your channel. One of the other things you do is try and foreground and draw attention to things that people might have missed. So the kind of conversations and stories on the edges that kind of shed a light on a deeper issue. So what are some of those stories at the moment that you're thinking about that you think deserve attention, that you think we should be kind of more in the center of attention in the news cycle?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the current conflict within the Middle East, if you look at the deaths in different countries, Lebanon actually has the highest number of deaths per capita. It's significantly more deadly, and what's happening in Lebanon is a lot more critical. I'm not trying to diminish what's happening in Iran, but Iran is obviously the biggest attention point because of the Strait of Hormuz, because of the negotiations. But when it comes to the human crisis, Lebanon is on the verge of being a failed state, and it's not really being discussed enough. When it comes to mainstream media created for mass market. For example, let's say Lebanon, or the crisis in Sudan, which is one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the modern history. Those don't necessarily get enough attention because people don't understand the fundamentals. So when you read a story that, let's say, the RSF killed 100 people in El Fasher. Okay, most people wouldn't know what RSF is, where El Fasher is, what's happening in Sudan. So those stories don't receive enough engagement, and they're ultimately deprioritized by mainstream media because they aim for the mass reach, for mass market. And I think through my content, I'm able to kind of highlight some of those things that people don't necessarily pay too much attention to. And that's the beauty, that's the opportunity of independent journalism, because you're able to have creators and journalists who focus on specific issues. used. So some of those, crises in Lebanon, the war in Sudan. We also have an election in Hungary, which is the most important European election this year. So some of those things, media space is limited, especially when it comes to big media organizations. That's where the opportunity of independent journalism comes into play, as long as it's done truthfully with honest and factual reporting.
Yeah, fascinating. And what do you think, I was maybe going to draw you on what you think is about to happen in Hungary, because you had some really interesting polling information. And what I loved about your recent story on that was that you were really getting into the detail. You weren't just giving the polling, but you were unpacking who was doing the polling, why they were doing it. And I think that's something that is so important and so often lost in this country, or in news media generally. Polling has a huge amount, any journalism has bias to it, but polling in particular does. And it's often done with people to try and present one person as the insurgent and one person as the rightful winner. So what do you think is about to happen in Hungary from your story? Or you just present us with the evidence, you don't say what you think.
I don't actually make predictions because I don't, it's just in politics, it's impossible. The polling data shows that Viktor Orban is going to lose. Now, but that's actually not, I would say before some people get too excited or too upset, what is the big variable is how big he's going to lose. Because if it's a very tiny majority of the winning party, then it would be very difficult to make any institutional change, because Viktor Orban had a super majority. He changed the Hungarian system completely. He changed the legal system. He put a lot of loyalists in different institutions. And if there is a tiny majority, then making those changes is going to be almost impossible. So just because Viktor Orban is going to lose doesn't necessarily mean that there will be a structural change in Hungary that is going to last long term. But so far, polling indicates that he's going to lose. Now, we have to also keep in mind that while he was in power, he changed the the voting electoral map in a way that benefits him. So even if he loses by a substantial margin, it might not translate in the same number of seats in parliament.
Okay, that's such an interesting analysis. And just before, when we were chatting backstage, you were kind of frantically uploading some stories to Instagram, and you said you felt like you were in a kind of problematic relationship with Donald Trump, because whenever he posts anything, you're like, oh God, he's posted, and I need to post again. And it is sort of an abusive relationship, because he does that thing that abusive partners might do, where he kind of love bombs you, and then he tells you he's going to kick the door down, and then it's so inconsistent. We're stuck into this cycle. So how are you navigating that? And do you blink twice if we need you to rescue you? Yeah.
It's very fascinating, because as a content creator, he gives you so much content, like on every single day. Normally the British government would release like the official press release statement. You would have to go to the government website. It's very dry. It's very, you have to reread it a couple of times to really understand what's happening. With Donald Trump, it's different, because so he posts only on Truth Social, which is his social media network. He doesn't use other social media websites. I've got it on my phone, and I have a notification for every time he posts something. And I only follow him. I only follow one account. And it's kind of like you wake up in the morning and, you get like 7 messages that feel like direct text messages, because he like writes in caps lock and he's shouting at you, and it's like he's speaking directly with you, and it's kind of like feels like an abusive relationship. Like, okay, what else did I do wrong today? Like, what else do you need? And it's like a lot of manipulation, like, oh, our NATO allies, they didn't help us, but we don't actually need their help. It's kind of the same, like, as in an abusive relationship where it's like, well, you could have done it, but I don't actually need you to do anything, but you still could have done it, and maybe you should do it, but I don't need you to do anything. And it's over and over again. So it's a little bit like that. Like just before, I came here, like 5 minutes before we started, he posted that he was going to close, the US military is also going to close the Strait of Hormuz. Which is such a huge development that you find out through social media, but that's the reality.
Wait, what did he just say? I've missed this.
So that Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, yes. But now allegedly the U.S. military will also do the same. So Iran can't take advantage of it either, and it's kind of like who's going to give in first.
So he's okay. So he's
because Iran wants to
breaking live.
charge for the because Iran wants to charge for the use
Yes, I
of the
saw that,
strait.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
if the U.S. Navy is able to close the strait as well,
I
then
see.
Iran won't be able to take advantage of it as well, and then nobody can benefit. He didn't say that, but I assume that's the logic because he said he would start the process of closing the Strait of Hormuz. So. Yeah, because now some ships are going through, but they're usually aligned with the Iranian state, or I guess they pay, like there was some reports that they were paying in Bitcoin or you know, in crypto.
So that would obviously what's happening at the moment is JD Vance has been in Pakistan having those negotiations.
Yeah, he left now.
He's just left, yeah. And I mean, maybe you can give us your analysis or give us some facts and nuance to this. He's gone, JD Vance has left. That was the beginning of negotiations, or is that the end of them? And this seems like now military expansion into the Strait of Hormuz. So what are people in this kind of psychodrama that we're locked in with Trump, and we're trying to kind of unpack the wider geopolitical movements of it, what do you think's getting missed? Because I know we're all stuck in this kind of emotional roller coaster, which is what he wants in a way, because he loves spectacle politics, he loves drawing attention away from his many domestic problems, and indeed the kind of accusations of him being much more involved in the Epstein files than he'd care to admit. So there's this whole psychodrama of his own making. To read through that, what do you think's? You've just got this kind of hot thing that's hot off the press. What are some facts and information around that we're perhaps missing a little?
So one thing President Trump said yesterday, that one of the reporters asked him, the negotiations failed. How do you feel about it? And he said, we don't actually care about negotiations because we won. And then today he comes on to say that, no, we're going to do X, Y, Z. He still said in the message that they got a lot done and Iran caved and whatever. But the point is that there's going to be I don't want to make predictions, but it's either escalation or compromise. It's hard to imagine the Iranians to compromise, but I think one thing that I would, if anyone is as interested in geopolitics, one thing to pay attention to is China. China has substantial influence over Iran. There's been reports that the only reason Iran agreed to the ceasefire is because China asked the Iranian officials to be more flexible. That was the quote from the New York Times, who broke that story. So I would say one thing that maybe we don't necessarily pay attention to is the role of China. If the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, that even China is not able to get its oil through it, then that's ultimately going to play a big role. So it's either a compromise or escalation. We shall see. But Pakistan plays a role, but ultimately they don't have the kind of political power. They're more of a mediator. But behind the scenes, it's China that has quite a big influence on what's happening.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, I suppose one thing that's so fascinating about it as well is that this kind of topographical removement of the government in Iran, the danger with that is that if that military escalation keeps going on, you need to have somebody to negotiate with. And a failed state is, as Iraq and other places show, is incredibly dangerous for its neighbors as well. So we as I agree, we don't know we're at the foothills of something. And do you see then what's next? Is it reactive for you? Are you just responding to what's in the news, or are there things that you're having deep dive investigations to that are slow burning in the back that you think are also stories that are coming in the next few months that we're going to be really watching out for? How much of that is anticipated?
I think the goal. I'm not, to be honest. People do call me a journalist. I don't really position myself like that. I like to think of myself as an educator, because the goal of my content is to take what's happening and help people understand it a little bit better. Yeah. Maybe with a historical context, or maybe connecting the dots, like what I said about China, and understanding the role of the second biggest economy in this. So I don't really do a lot of predictions or trying to investigate. I had so many messages about when are you going to talk about Epstein files? When are you going to, it's impossible. It's if you want to do thorough reporting into Epstein files, it's going to take you months to go through millions of documents. And that's not my job. I would rely on other journalists who, dedicate all of their time on investigating those crimes. That's not what I do. So my content is more educational, helping people connect the dots, more reactive in some respect. I don't try to be the first. I always prioritize being, factual. But yeah, that's kind of what I do.
Yeah, and I wonder if people like you, there's a hope for a future in which social media can carry more nuance and celebrate facts more. And maybe we're in a moment where actually you might be a testament to the appetite for high arousal content that feels very stimulating and arresting, but unhealthy, is maybe passing. And I think that's something that we try to do here at Sunday Papers as well, is that feeling that in-person stuff still matter, facts still matter, and maybe we're going to look back at social media as the same way we looked at smoking or other incredibly harmful things.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the algorithm, though. Like, because I feel very positive about social media. I have my questions about there is like a big wave of banning social media to teenagers, like under 16, so 15. So
yeah, in Australia they've passed that law, and then there's
passed
language
it.
here.
Now Greece is looking to do it. France is looking to do it. There are conversations in the UK. Estonia is the only European country that came out against it. Estonia is a very kind of digital country with a lot of digital industry. Ultimately, we have to like separate the algorithms from the actual platforms. And as I mentioned before, the biggest issue with the information is the incentive. Because if you incentivize by engagement and nothing else, if misleading content doesn't get deprioritized, you look at, I think X is the biggest kind of, when you look at the most engaged accounts on X, it's a disaster. Like the kind of accounts that get all of the, and X also pays you for views as well, and you incentivize not just by going viral, but also you have a financial incentive, and there is no evidence-based element to it or factuality in that incentive. It's purely engagement.
Yeah, and I think some of the principles we need to hang on to with that are the algorithm's very opaque, so we need to really legislate or campaign to have transparency, because all we know at the moment is that they prioritize attention retention without any form of other ethical considerations, although that might be changing with Facebook being defeated in the US. But do we have any questions in the audience?